Deconversion can cost you everything. In a world where belief is often assumed, the A in atheist easily becomes a scarlet letter. There are entire professions built on assumed belief. In those spaces, atheism or deconversion isn't just a private shift in a worldview, it's a liability, a stigma, a scarlet letter that can cost you your livelihood, your reputation, and your sense of self. There are two key ideas that keep coming back to me as I've thought about this. Number one, the prevalence of environments that assume belief, and that's churches, faith based nonprofits, Christian schools, values based organizations, but even secular organizations that often get soaked in God taught culture. There's also, though, a cultural failure that we haven't built robust, visible, secular alternatives where these folks can exist honestly and still use their gifts. In today's conversations, I'm not just criticizing that, I'm exploring possible solutions while calling it out on the carpet. So, to truly platform this conversation, let's start with how assumed belief functions at work. I want to name a few dynamics that show up across all of the professions that we're going to walk through today. Number one, social contracts, right? There's this idea that we all believe is baked into the job that often comes with prayers, staff devotions, mission statements, and even donor expectations. And there's also moral suspicion. If you're not a believer, you're seen as less trustworthy, less safe, less moral. And there's even the dynamic of economic coercion. Your paycheck depends on staying on script, not just at work, but even in your personal life. So people learn to perform belief just to survive. When I started sharing content on my YouTube page, making it clear of who I was and living as my authentic self, I was a rising star in the company that I was working for in the corporate sector. I had already been promoted 3 times within 3 years and was being considered for 2 more promotions up until the moment I was brought in for a conversation about my videos. Back to regularly scheduled programming. And there's also the dynamic of identity entanglement. Your calling, friendships, and community are tied to your role. So deconverting can feel like social suicide. So now that we've explored the dynamics, now I actually want to hit some key professions that are actually being impacted by the scarlet letter syndrome or living in this world of assumed belief. The first one is pretty obvious, okay? Pastors risk losing their job, their community, their housing, sometimes their spousing and family stability altogether. Many stay in the pulpit long after they've actually stopped believing because there is nowhere else to use their communication, leadership, counseling, and organization skills without starting over at zero. And me speaking from personal experience, that's absolutely inhumane, intolerable, and unacceptable. It's one of the reasons I stayed in the closet even after stepping down from being a pastor. I stayed in the closet as an atheist and didn't share with people more broadly because I didn't want anybody losing everything because of me. So the idea of an atheist pastor becomes a scandal instead of a normal human evolution. Now, I do want to highlight that there has been some scenarios and some situations where a pastor has absolutely deconverted in the pulpit and somehow their congregation was still able to embrace them. Just 2 weeks ago on my channel, I had Joe Pittinger from West Hill United, a congregation that experienced that exact thing about 20 years ago. Their pastor, which was a female pastor, Greta Vosper, came out of the closet as a non-believer, as a non-theist, and then eventually as an atheist. And then her congregation decided to follow her on that new journey. And so now that congregation has shifted from being a faith-based community to being a values-based community. And it's those small wins that I want the rest of us to be mindful of. All right, so to be honest, the pastor's low hanging fruit, right? So let's move on to the next profession that's often impacted by living in this world of assumed belief. And maybe you guessed this one too: singers and musicians. Across every major genre, whether we're dealing with gospel, pop, hip hop, R&B, CCM, and even indie, artists are often expected to project some kind of belief. Country artists risk losing entire markets without it. Hip hop leans on spirituality and Christocentric destiny language. Pop and R&B rewards the thank God culture, even if it's not in their lyrics. And gospel and CCM punishes any doubt instantly. Even indie artists use spiritual branding to seem grounded. Being openly atheist can cost visibility, bookings, and entire audiences. Across genres, there is an expectation. If your platform reaches the masses, you must affirm something supernatural. If you don't, you risk being seen as unrelatable, ungrateful, or dangerously secular. Many artists who deconvert or never believed at all feel trapped by industry expectations and standards, fan culture, branding, and the fear of being labeled the atheist artist. So they code switch, thanking God on stage, using faith adjacent language, and avoiding honesty to stay marketable. Being open risks their tours, their label support, their sponsorships, fan connections, and even safety in certain regions. The tragedy is that they can't be fully honest in the very art meant to express who they are. If an artist openly identifies as atheist, they risk being branded anti God, losing fans, partnerships, venues, and becoming a target for conservative media. The industry often blacklists those who break the illusion. If they stay silent, they're forced into a double life, performing gratitude to a God they don't believe in because the industry rewards the performance. Singers and musicians across all genres, from gospel to country to hip hop, operate under an unspoken rule. Belief is marketable. Atheism is dangerous, so countless artists have to hide their real worldview just to keep their careers alive. Now, you may not have thought of this next one naturally, but as soon as I say it, it should ring a bell. Childcare professionals. Atheist child care workers are often treated as a threat to the child's faith or innocence. Even in secular settings, parents and employers assume belief equals morality, and disbelief signals danger. One rumor or misplaced assumption can cost them job security, trust, and long term career prospects. In many communities, safe childcare is coded language for Christian childcare. Most daycares, preschools, after school programs, and private schools are run by churches or faith centric organizations. In those environments, non believing staff are viewed with quiet suspicion and contempt. They are monitored more closely, they're questioned more often, and expected to keep their worldview hidden. Even in public settings, atheist childcare providers feel pressure to soften their non belief to avoid being labeled unsafe, untrustworthy, or not a good influence on the kids. The question that haunts them, spoken or unspoken, is, would you really trust an atheist with your kids? This stigma doesn't come from evidence, it comes from cultural conditioning. And once that suspicion attaches to them, it follows them from job to job, shaping how parents, coworkers, and supervisors interpret everything they do. They're not judged by their competency, they're judged by their perceived lack of faith, and that turns a private worldview into a professional liability. Let's continue. Our next profession that is severely impacted by living in a world of assumed belief, very similar to childcare professionals, is the next leap on the ladder: educators. For educators, not believing or no longer believing can be seen as a threat to values, character, or even community standards. In religious regions, an openly atheist teacher risks parent complaints, administrative scrutiny, stalled career growth, or even termination in private or faith based schools. Even in public schools where beliefs shouldn't matter, cultural expectations often make disbelief feel dangerous. Schools are some of the most belief assumed environments in American life. Morning prayers, holiday programs, religious traditions, and faith respecting classroom culture blur the line between civic and spiritual norms. Teachers who deconvert or never believed at all are expected to quietly participate or at least not disrupt the assumed religious atmosphere. Even in public schools, many teachers keep their non belief off of their personal social media, avoid controversial topics, and constantly self censor to protect their careers. Educators carry the stigma of Are they teaching my kids morals if they don't believe in God? That suspicion turns them into ideological threats rather than trusted professionals. Their competence becomes secondary to a fear that their worldview might somehow infect the classroom. The result? Countless brilliant educators teach with restraint, hide who they are, and walk on eggshells, not because of poor performance, but because disbelief is treated as a moral deficiency instead of a private conviction. Now, this next profession that's impacted by assumed belief is a little close to home for me because, as many pastors who deconverted and deconstructed, becoming a life coach or a motivational speaker was an easy route to continue using my skills up until I realized how much assumed belief impacts that profession. In the coaching and motivation industry, faith language is deeply normalized. From God given purpose to walking in your calling, the entire field often assumes a spiritual or religious framework. Coaches and speakers who don't believe risk alienating clients, losing credibility with faith saturated audiences, or being seen as lacking moral authority. Many coaching environments, life coaching, business coaching, leadership coaching, mindset coaching, and even personal development speaking borrow heavily from church culture. The messaging, the tone, and structure often require faith in something bigger than you talk because churches and faith based organizations are major buyers of coaching and speaking services. So many professionals in this field feel forced to keep their non belief hidden. For non believing or deconverting speakers, this means having to avoid honesty to remain inspirational. It means masking secular frameworks with spiritual language to seem relatable, being pressured by event hosts to include God centered messaging, and even feeling professionally limited because atheist speaker is considered a liability. Even in corporate environments, leadership culture often imports Christian coded values, servant leadership, calling, gratitude to a higher power. So coaches quietly adjust their language to fit the expectations. Behind the scenes, many are exhausted from having to spiritualize their secular expertise just to maintain broad appeal. The stigma is this: how can you motivate people if you don't believe in God? This assumption reduces their skill set, psychology, strategy, communication, emotional intelligence, and even performance science to a single faith test, so they keep quiet. They reframe humanist principles as spiritual platitudes. They stay vague about their worldview to avoid blowback from religious clients, conferences, and audiences. Not because they're dishonest people, but because their industry treats disbelief as incompatible with inspiration. They're allowed to change lives as long as they pretend that it's belief that's helping them do it. And if that's not a racket, I don't know what is. Another profession that is clearly impacted by a world of assumed belief are therapists. Therapists who deconvert or never believed often face quiet but heavy suspicion. In many communities, a therapist who isn't religious is seen as lacking a moral foundation, being anti faith, or being unable to support religious clients. Now, this can lead to lost clientele, blocked referrals, and tension within agencies that assume spirituality as a part of holistic care. Mental health work is deeply intertwined with religious culture in the US. Many clients expect their therapists to validate faith based worldviews, pray with them, or even integrate scripture into sessions. Inside agencies, the pressure is real. Faith based organizations control a large portion of counseling jobs. Supervisors may expect therapists to frame treatment in spiritual terms. Non believing therapists may be excluded from certain roles or training tracks, and religious colleagues may question their fit for family or couples therapy. For deconverting therapists, the shift is even more painful. They can lose the professional identity they built for themselves in Christian counseling environments, along with community trust and long-standing client relationships. Meanwhile, an enormous population of clients with religious trauma, purity culture harm, deconstruction, and identity conflict is desperately searching for secular therapists who won't spiritualize their pain. Yet many secular therapists feel they have to stay hidden. That's why organizations like the Secular Therapy Project are so vital. Therapists carry a particularly cutting stigma. How can you help heal people's soul if you don't believe in God? This framing turns a scientific, evidence based profession into a religious loyalty test. So, secular therapists code switch. They soften their language, avoid disclosing their worldview, and sometimes even allow clients to assume they're believers just to preserve the therapeutic alliance in religious regions. Not because they lack integrity, but because honesty can get them labeled unsafe, immoral, or unfit for vulnerable clients. The result? Many of the most capable therapists in the world are forced into silence about the worldview that shapes their real approach to healing. Now let's talk about politicians. For politicians, atheism is still one of the most damaging identities in American public life. Even a hint of non belief can cost votes, endorsements, community trust, and access to donor networks. In many districts, especially conservative or religious regions, openly identifying as atheist is considered political suicide. The risk isn't merely losing an election, it's being framed as morally unfit to lead. American politics American politics is built on ritualized public piety, prayer breakfasts, faith based coalitions, religious endorsements, God bless America speeches, and public performances of belief. Politicians who deconvert or never believed learn very quickly that the system assumes and rewards faith language. For non believing or deconstructing politicians, this plays out in deeply constraining ways. They must attend religious events to maintain optics. They speak in vague spiritual language to avoid backlash, and constituents expect them to affirm Christian values even when they don't share them. Opponents weaponize atheism as a character attack, using dog whistle terms such as godless, immoral, or un American. The stigma is blunt and unforgiving. How can someone who doesn't believe in God lead a moral nation? Atheism becomes shorthand for untrustworthy, immoral, dangerous, and again, un American. This stigma erases their real qualifications, their policy understanding, leadership skills, governing experience, and replaces them with a single disqualifying label. The cruel irony? Many of the people shaping laws that impact millions are not allowed to publicly express the worldview that most honestly reflects how they reason and decide. Now let's talk about the shocker that shouldn't be the shocker, but community service workers. Community service workers, and I'm talking social workers, nonprofit staff, outreach coordinators, case managers, youth program leaders, crisis responders, you name it. They often operate in environments where faith is built into the culture, the funding, and the community expectations. Atheists in these roles risk being seen as lacking compassion, lacking heart, or being unfit to serve vulnerable populations. In many regions, being open about non belief can cost them trust, partnership opportunities, and job stability. The community services world is heavily intertwined with churches, Christian nonprofits, and faith driven initiatives. Churches run food banks, shelters, after school programs, addiction support, reentry services, family support centers, refugee assistance, senior care, and holiday drives. Faith based organizations dominate the landscape of charitable work, especially in underserved areas. So even when the work itself is secular, the culture is still highly religious. For non believing or deconverting workers, this creates a daily tension. They must collaborate with religious organizations to serve the community, and funders may expect their programs to reflect faith based values. Even in secular agencies, workers often rely on partnership with churches for volunteers, supplies, grants, community trust, or access to families. Being seen as anti faith or openly atheist can jeopardize those partnerships and, by extension, their position, and their program. The stigma they shoulder is, can you really serve the community if you yourself don't believe in something bigger? This suspicion equates morality with belief and turns the absence of faith into a character flaw. Instead of being seen for their empathy, their skills, their boundaries, and dedication, they're judged by a religious metric that they never signed up for. So many community workers hide who they are, not because they're ashamed, but because honesty could undermine the partnerships, the trust, and the goodwill required to do their jobs. They're penalized for not fitting a spiritual narrative that has nothing to do with their actual ability to show up for people in crisis. In a field built on humanity, it's striking how often humanity is not enough. This last profession that I want to cover today is one that doesn't often get talked about in this conversation, and those are sales professionals. In many sales environments, whether we're talking about real estate, insurance, consulting, direct sales, business to business, multi level marketing, and even customer facing roles, religious language and Christian coded values shape the culture. Atheist professionals risk being seen as less trustworthy, less ethical, or not aligned with the team's values. In industries where relationships determine income, even a small shift in perceived morality can cost them clients, referrals, and advancement. Sales culture in the US is soaked in faith language, even when the company itself isn't religious. Phrases like servant leadership, blessed, purpose driven, and God centered success show up in team meetings, trainings, conferences, and motivational materials. Many sales teams rely on Christian networking circles and faith based business associations. In many organizations, the cultural script is explicitly Christian: serve like Jesus, lead like Jesus, even sell through relationship like Jesus. Employees who don't fit that narrative learn to perform belief in their tone, their language, or silence just to stay employable. When sales success depends on rapport, and rapport is often assumed to flow from shared faith, atheists become professionally vulnerable for reasons completely unrelated to their skill, honesty, or effectiveness. The underlying suspicion is, can you really be trusted with people's money if you don't believe in a God? This old stereotype treats disbelief as a moral defect rather than a worldview difference. It paints non believing professionals as risky hires, risky partners, and risky representatives of the brand, not because they lack integrity, but because the sales world often equates morality with belief and denies legitimacy to anyone who exists outside that frame. In an industry built on connection, it is painful how quickly connection collapses once a client senses you don't share their faith. And so the big question becomes, what are we costing ourselves by not creating secular alternatives, by not creating solutions for these people to find safe spaces to land that do not cost them their livelihood? What are we costing ourselves? By not creating secular alternatives, we're losing talent and innovation. We're losing brilliant communicators, organizers, artists, and leaders who stay stuck in roles where they can't even live their truth. We're losing authenticity and mental health. We normalize a culture where lying about your deepest conviction is seen as faithfulness. We're losing ethical clarity. People who might push institutions toward honesty, justice, and evidence based practice are silenced or pushed out. When the only stage, mic, or platform available is religious, we stifle the next generation of secular humanist led spaces. We keep telling people to just be honest, but we've built a world where honesty can cost them everything. That's not integrity, that's entrapment. This is one of the reasons why I am seriously committed to the work that I do. Because in that work with DODD World Group and Bridge City Global, we're doing at least three things. We're creating visible secular stages and platforms. Through Sunday sessions, Omniverse, Bridge City Global, the work that I'm doing as a licensed humanist practitioner, we're building places where people can use those same gifts: teaching, singing, organizing, consulting, motivating, caring, without having to worship a God they don't believe in. But we're also modeling a new kind of community economy. Between Patreon, memberships, licensing, content platforms, humanist practitioner services, we're experimenting with ways to pay people for secular, life affirming work that used to only be funded by religion. And I think probably the most vital aspect of our work is that we are reframing their skills as transferable and not wasted. Former pastors as communicators, celebrants, humanist guides, worship leaders as secular musicians and composers for humanist spaces, church administrators as operations leaders in community as a service ecosystems, therapists, educators, and coaches as core builders of a values based, not faith based world. The work I'm doing is about proving one simple thing: you shouldn't have to choose between your integrity and your income. See, these are just a fraction of the people who are pretending to live just to survive, just to feel a little peace. My mission is to change that, to help them stop pretending, to help them live out loud, and to build communities where their skills, their stories, and their scars actually move humanity forward. I'm building spaces where former believers and quiet non believers can tell the truth, use their gifts, and still pay the bills. Thank you so much for watching this video to the end today. Listen, I got a few announcements for you. Starting this weekend, we're preparing to soar through new possibilities in a new Sunday session series that we're calling Flight School. Every year, we lift off with dreams, goals, and new intentions. But before we can soar, we have to understand the skies we're flying through. Flight School is an end of the year series designed to help us learn life's in flight protocol, how to handle turbulence, when to buckle up, how to deal with emotional hijackers, and how to travel light enough to rise. This isn't about escaping the world, it's about learning how to navigate it. Flight School is your pre flight checklist for 2026: release, readiness, responsibility, resilience, and recovery. So grab your seat, buckle up, and prepare to soar through new possibilities. Meet us back here this weekend. Also, Bridge City Global is growing so far and so fast right now, and we want to make sure every single person knows exactly where they fit, how to connect, and how to take their next step in this movement. For 7 days, we're opening the doors to our entire global campus, our clubs, our teams, our projects, our leaders, our conversations, all of it. This is our first official open house. Starting with our kickoff event this Sunday evening, we'll have an orientation, do some recognitions, and in the evening with a Pictionary night, which I'm looking forward to. It's the perfect reset and reentry point for the whole community. Each day after kickoff, our different clubs will host different events, activities, or challenges on our global campus. That Monday, our communications club is hosting a social media party and a contest. On that Wednesday, I'll actually be showcasing some original music live. On Thursday, our Deconstruction club is hosting a live event that I will be a part of. You just got to check the calendar. It's actually going to be a packed week. And then we're going to wrap the week spending time reflecting on the week's highlights, member stories, and club moments. We'll officially close the night out strong with our first community movie night, where we're going to be watching an interesting documentary together called This Is How We Change the World. So if you've been watching from the sidelines, if you've been meaning to plug back in, if you've tapped in but haven't got in, if you've been looking for your people, Open House Week is your moment. Head over to the global campus, check out the open house post, and mark your calendars. Family, let's make this next season the most connected we've ever been. And last but not least, if this community has inspired you, challenged you, helped you feel less alone, or given you a space to grow, consider supporting today. You can give right now using any of the links in the description. All right, folks, that's all for today. Thank you for hanging out with me. Until next time, keep rising.